Hello everybody. Thanks again for visiting my YouTube channel. This is the place where we discuss the Lord's Recovery Movement of Witness Lee, also known as the Local Church Movement. Well, I wanted to get back to these three messages on shepherdingwords.com put out in October of 2020, which basically say why the Lord's Recovery feels like it must separate itself from other Christian works and ministries and even churches. It's kind of amazing that they put this out so clearly and plainly because basically what they are saying, and I'm going to make this case, they are basically saying that they have unique rights to be sectarian in all the world. That's basically what they're saying. Now, every group down through history that has become a sect, become a divisive denomination, become a group that is antagonistic toward other Christians and Christian groups to the point of not wanting to have anything to do with them, every one of them starts out with the same attitude the Lord's Recovery has, which is, we got it right, we got a special commission, nobody sees what we see, we got to be true to what we believe, this is very important and we have to stick to this and we can't compromise on this. Then they proceed to become a sect while all the time acting as if they aren't a sect and even saying they are the true way. This is the way it happens with all of them. Okay? You have to see that. There's nothing different about this. There's something so subtly tricky about their reasoning that they've fooled themselves. Now, the Catholic Church says, we are the church that was started by Peter, and we're the one true church, and we are the universal church, and everybody needs to join us, and these other people split off from us. Everybody looks at them and says, well, we don't agree, and you got problems, and look at your history. We feel like it's okay for us to split off. And the Catholic Church said, no, it's not okay. And they still have the attitude somewhat that they're it. Now, they've become a lot more understanding because Christians are starting to see the truth about oneness, which is amazing that the Lord's Recovery doesn't see it. The Lord's Recovery is still stuck in kind of the Catholic view of oneness in that there's one movement that everybody needs to join, and it's us, by the way, at this point in history, which is what every sectarian movement has ever done. They all do the same thing. Somebody sees something and decides this is too important to compromise on, and then they become a sect over it. In the Lord's Recovery, the amazing thing is they've made oneness a point of sectarianism. They are sectarian over being non-sectarian. That's what they're doing. That's why it's so bizarre, and that's why it fools them, because they've actually made themselves a sect over not being a sect. We can't be a sect. We have to be one. So we're going to make ourselves a sect over this issue. This is what they do. And they made up the ground of oneness. I could see how it sort of makes sense early on, and it kind of made sense to me when I was in it. But then you start to look at two things. Number one, the fruit, and number two, what the Bible actually says about this. And if you look at both of those, you really start to question this teaching. Does it sort of make sense to the human mind that there should be one way to have church and everybody needs to do that and join that church because the church is supposed to be one, right? That sort of makes sense to the human mind. But the question is, or the problem is the Bible doesn't give us a way to do that. The Bible does not prescribe this. It doesn't even describe it. They say in one of these messages that the clear pattern was that every Christian in the first century met as the church in the city. That's not true. There's no record of anybody meeting as the church in the city, ever. There's no record of anybody ever saying, if you're going to meet, you need to meet as the church in the city. Now, a church should meet as the church, but it never records or says that they met as the church in the city. It mentions churches in cities, and it mentions meetings, but it never says they met as the church in the city. It never puts down that requirement. Now think about this. The Lord's Recovery is coming up with this requirement of oneness, and yet it's not anything that's mandated in the Bible. And they are making it a requirement to the point they say you can't even be a church if you don't do this. I would say that is being divisive over oneness. Just because you meet as Crystal Brook Community Church doesn't mean that you cannot also at the same time meet as the church. There was a church in Nympha's house. They met as the church in the house of Nympha. There was a church in the house of Aquila and Priscilla. They met as the church in the house of Aquila and Priscilla. But they also met in both places as the church. They met as both. So you can meet as Crystal Brook Community Church, and you can meet as the church, and you could do it at the same time. The restrictions the Lord's Recovery is putting on what is a meeting of the church and what isn't is not biblical or scriptural. It's not. I believe that it started out with good intentions. It started out with Watchman Nee wanting to be able to say, we are meeting in a proper way. And he saw this pattern. But it soon became a way of saying they were it and nobody else was. It became a way for them to separate themselves from others and justify it in their minds, to the point where they convinced themselves that this was true. But let's look at the fruit of it. The fruit, number one, is a small, obscure, almost invisible sect that claims to be right, that claims to be true, that carries almost all the characteristics of what sociologists and cult experts call a cult, in that they have an authoritarian structure. They deny anybody else has the truth as well as they do. They revere their founder and consider him without fault. They use misinformation, half-truths, and out-and-out lies to control their membership. They are antagonistic toward other groups. They think they're the one true way. This is all bad fruit. Bad fruit. More bad fruit is the damage those things do to people, of which I was one person. But there are a lot more, and you can see them on places like localchurchdiscussions.com and some of the Facebook and other social media sites where these people gather to discuss. But a lot of damage was done, which the Lord's Recovery ignores. Also, they've become extreme in a lot of views in ways that are damaging. They have assumed doctrines which are not healthy, which don't reflect well on other Christians and the church as a whole and the truth as a whole. For example, saying that man becomes God. That's bad fruit. That's the example of a teaching that has not been vetted by the body of Christ. The beauty of the church, and I've alluded to this before, is you come out with your ministry and you start teaching, and you teach it freely. You don't cloister up and get antagonistic and defensive about your teaching. You share it freely in love, and you let the church give you feedback about it. What ends up happening is the good stuff sticks and the bad stuff falls away. Now, the way the Lord's Recovery is they don't trust Christians. They don't trust Christians at all. They don't think Christians have spirits. They don't think they have any discernment, because their whole attitude is Christians need to be controlled. They need to be controlled by this teaching of the local ground so they don't sneak away and start their own thing, because that would be divisive. And they don't trust them to know the truth and to figure out the truth for themselves. They say, you got to listen to the ministry. You got to do it our way. This is a very authoritarian structure. And that's why their main teachings serve this authoritarianism. That's what the local ground is all about. It's all about controlling people. Now, they say it's to produce this oneness that the world can see. But ironically, in trying to do that, they are actually producing division. They're not producing oneness. They're basically saying, to be one, you got to do what we do the way we say to do it, and if you don't, you're divisive. I ask reasonable, sober-minded Christians to ask themselves, is this the way God would do things? Would he say, there's this hidden truth in the Bible that tells you how to meet as a church, and the way to meet as the church is you have to meet as the church in the city. And if you don't do that, you're divisive. But the little obscure group that insists on doing that, insists on doing something that the Bible doesn't mandate, they're not being divisive. That's what they want you to believe. I would say oneness is a good thing, but it is not something you can mandate with a doctrine like the local ground. Are Christians one in the city in reality? Of course we are, because we're all part of the church. We're all Christians. We're all one in the Spirit. That's the reality. Should we all cooperate with each other and love each other and do our best to work together? Of course, and that's beginning to happen more than it ever has. But you don't do it by insisting that everybody meet the way you do and say you can only call yourself the church in the city because we've decided that's the way it is. That's doctrine. That is not a point of faith. Being divisive means being antagonistic. It doesn't mean I don't choose to believe the doctrine that you're pushing on me. If you continue to push it, then you're the divisive one. Then you're the antagonistic one. Even if your doctrine in your mind is supposed to produce the very oneness that we are supposed to have, you start pushing that doctrine, you are becoming divisive. And that's the paradox of the local ground. It is a doctrine that's supposed to be about oneness that actually is divisive. The Lord's Recovery wants to be separate. They think they have this thing of this pure recovery, and they desperately want to be separate from everybody else because they're so pure and they have everything right and they don't want to be tainted, and they're going to bring back all the truth to the earth, and that's going to be such a good thing. And the local ground is the excuse. The purity is the reason. The local ground is the excuse, or the local ground is the means by which they separate themselves. They establish the local ground teaching as a stake in the ground that says, you don't do this, we don't have to be one with you. But the reason is just so they can have their thing. The local ground is the means by which they justify their separation from everybody else so they can do what they're doing. So the local ground is their excuse for sectarianism. That's what it is, because what they want to be is a sect. They want to be separate from other Christian groups and works and ministries and churches, and that is the definition of sectarianism, not to mention snobbery. It's what they are, and don't let anybody ever tell you otherwise. But it's a new year. It's 2021. Maybe 2021 will be the year that humanity makes a rebound and the Lord's Recovery repents from their divisive sectarianism. Let's hope and pray for that. Thanks again for listening. Happy New Year. Take care.